Good morning, Ma'am Hidalgo. I'm here to ask you a few questions about your writing. So the first question is, most writers have a certain ritual that they do before they write. Do you have one of those?
No, I don't follow any rituals. And the reason for it is, when I started my really serious writing, as in the works that eventually became my books, I was living in Beirut. I had a newborn baby and no maid, so I hardly had any time to write, and I would steal the time. So usually by 10 o'clock, the family would be asleep, and then I'd be waiting for the last feeding of the baby. So between 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock midnight is when I would write. So I trained myself to just write, you know, and when there was time to spare, I would sit down and write. And then when the baby woke up, I gave the baby the last feeding, and then I went to sleep. So during the time that we were living in Beirut, I told myself, if you want to go on writing, despite the fact that you have chosen to follow your husband's job, which was to a different country each time, then you have to train yourself to write under any circumstances. So that period, I think, was very good for my training as a writer. Before that, actually I began writing very early. You know, I was in high school when I was first published in a national magazine. It was an essay. And then in college, I was writing I had a weekly column in the newspaper, the Manila Chronicle. But that kind of writing was easy for me. I could write, you know, a column for, maybe I would take a couple of hours and then I'd be done. So that was okay. I don't quite consider that serious. My short stories, I would write only one story a year during that period before Beirut, no, when I was still living in Manila. So we left my husband joined UNICEF in 1975. And when I decided that I would go with him, bringing the children, I realized I had to give up my career. So at the time, my career as a professional writer was just starting. And I had to give it up, right?
For love.
Okay, for love. And so our first posting was Bangkok. And then I began writing travel essays, right? So that became what I did mostly during the 15 years that we lived overseas. I wrote those travel essays. And that is what I was describing when I was telling you that I would steal the time between chores. No? So in Bangkok, I had a full-time job in a magazine, so I was also very busy. But I would try to write my own thing, again at night. And then in Beirut, because I had a newborn baby and 2 other children and no maid, then I would, while the washing machine was running, then I would sit at my table and write, and, you know. So walang ritual. So even today, when I have more, I no longer have small children, I'm still very busy because of my jobs, but I find the time to do the writing, my own private writing, when I can. So I'm not sentimental about it. No? I just do it because I want to, and ganun.
Such discipline to just sit
I
down.
don't know if it's discipline or I'm just following my drummer, right? I'm a writer, so I write. Yeah. I tell my students, as you know, that you should learn to do it that way, because in the third world, none of us have commissions, none of us are full-time writers, so you just have to do it.
It's amazing to just write while taking care of a child, when most mothers would just lay down and die.
No, actually, I think that's the part of my life that I'm a bit sorry about, that practically my entire life I've been a professional woman, no, with a job, even when we were living abroad, that time when I was taking care of the baby and being full-time housewife was actually only 2 years when we were living in Beirut. But there was a war, no? So there was no question of my getting a job at that time. So I stayed home and looked after the family while my husband worked. But in his other postings like Bangkok, Seoul, Rangoon, which is now Yangon, and New York City, I got jobs, whatever job I could get. So generally teaching, writing, editing. So actually something was sacrificed, and I'm afraid it was my children. I had children throughout that time. No, they were little, but it's a privilege or a benefit given to diplomats. And when my husband worked for the UN, no, UNICEF, so that the UN agencies have diplomatic standing. So we were allowed to bring a maid. So usually I had a Filipina yaya looking after my children. But if I were to do it over, and I mean this, I think I would have not done it that way. I would have taken care of my children and gotten part-time jobs. Now I think for the women of your generation, it is more possible because there are more options. You can work from the house, actually. I have so many students whose jobs are writing on the net, right? They get jobs online, and they can do this while running their houses. In other words, they're there, yeah, they're present for their children. I wasn't, and that I regret, yeah. And if I could do it over, I'd do it differently.
But you seem to have a good relationship with all of your children. It doesn't seem to.
Well, I hope so, but only they can say whether they were happy about that setup. Because now it's too late, no? I mean, the two of them live in the States. One of them, only one lives with me, no? So that part of it, I think you would need to ask them. I don't know what they think of our relationship. Yeah.
But if you were to do it all over again, definitely you wouldn't give up writing.
No,
right?
no. I couldn't give up writing. That would always still be my, in terms of, because you're not only a mother, of course, no. You are I guess you are a professional in some profession, right? And mine is writing and teaching. I would never have given them up, but they would have taken a back seat, I think, to being a mother while the children needed it. I think when they are grown up enough to be, let us say, in college, maybe even in high school, then you could become a full-time professional career woman. But when they're small, I think they really need you. And I'm sorry that I learned it too late. I don't think this is where you expected the interview to go. So we can go back on track if you want. But yeah, I would have been full-time mother and part-time career woman during the childhood of my children. And that's what I advise all the young women who talk to me now.
It's important that this interview went that way, because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was about women in general, because a huge part of your research work deals with women writers, and that's a huge deal when it comes to being a woman in the Philippines and choosing to become a writer. Was it an advocacy of yours to write about women?
To write about women? No, it was not. Being a woman and a writer, I have always been conscious of the fact that the demands on a woman are different from the demands on a man. So even when you do choose to be a professional writer, as I did, even when you have a career, people expect different things from you than they expect of men. So for instance, my husband, it would never occur to, let us say, the maids to bother him when he's working, to call him up in his office and ask him what to do about the busted pipe, or or naubusan pala ng tinapay, or something like that. No, but they've always felt that the mother can be disturbed, whatever it is that she's doing. No? So even now, my own daughter and my household help, they call me up in the office whenever something goes wrong in the house. They feel that it's all right to disturb me. And of course, when I'm working at home, they would always disturb me. So I was aware of all that, and I kind of just accepted it. No? I didn't start researching on women until later. No? I was more concerned with just being a writer myself. No? My researching into women and the circumstances of a woman writer's life came when I returned from living overseas for 15 years, and then I just went back to my job in UP. And then I taught the first course in UP on women's writing. And my dissertation was, because when I came back, when I left, I had already done my 18 units of my PhD. I was working on a PhD in comparative literature in UP when my husband decided to join UNICEF. So I gave that up. I gave up also my PhD. So when I came back, my contemporaries were already deans and chairs of their departments. One was vice president of a university. So I thought, wow, I'm instructor 3 or 4. I don't remember what rank they gave me when I came back. But I was happy enough that they gave me back my old job. I was very grateful to UP for that. But then I told myself, okay, you have to finish your PhD in a hurry to make up for lost time. So I finished it in a year and a half. I had to re-enroll for all the 18 units I'd taken were nullified. And so I enrolled again, and I knew from the beginning that my dissertation would be about the autobiographical writing of women. Yeah. While I was living abroad, I had read a lot of autobiographical works by women and discovered that there's a long tradition of autobiographical writing by women in the West. Puro West, ano? Kasi yung East, wala namang nag-aaral ng mga autobiographical writing of women in Asia. So I had not yet found those works. So I found the works by the Western women whose fiction I had read. But I discovered that they had also done non-fiction like Edith Wharton and Colette and Anne Nin and Simone de Beauvoir, people like that, Maxine Hong Kingston. So I thought, I wonder what about the Philippines? Is there autobiographical writing being done by Filipino women writers? Of course, I found none listed under autobiography or memoir, wala. So what I did is I studied the personal essays of the women that I admired, Filipino women writers, and that became my dissertation. Yeah. So that's when I started. So that would have been 1990 onwards when I came home. So then it did become a kind of advocacy, because when I read them, I realized that they were really writing, they were swimming against the tide. No? First of all, in the Philippines, even in the other genres, there were really fewer women who had published. So in terms of, for instance, if you think of I'm really only familiar with the literature in English, I'm afraid to say. No? I don't know enough about the literature in Filipino or Tagalog or the other Philippine languages. So when I speak of women writers, I'm only speaking about writers in English. Yeah, so for instance, if you think of our first generation writers in English, let's say the Veronicans, so that would be Franz Arcellana and V.M. Gonzalez, that group of writers, there's only one woman, and it's Estrella Alfon. And then in the next generation, the Ravens, sila Elmer Ordóñez, Adrian Cristobal, that group, again, only one woman, and that's Virgie Moreno. So Estrella Alfon, we are only familiar, or we were only taught her short stories, no? Particularly Magnificence. Probably the only story most Filipino, even Filipino literature teachers and Filipino writers, that's the one they're familiar with. And then if you take the Ravens, Virgie Moreno, her poetry. So, ganun yung, it's uneven. It was always uneven. But with regard to the essay and the memoir, there really hardly anything. So what I did is I looked under their essay collections, and then I found what I was looking for. So what I found were short autobiographical narratives, which we now recognize as memoirs. No? At the time, wala pa. So when that dissertation came out, maybe when did I defend my dissertation? Hindi ko na maalala eh. 1992 maybe. and then it became a book. My dissertation was published by Ateneo. Filipino Women Writing, that's the title. 10 autobiographical narratives by Filipino women. It was the first of its kind.
Yes.
But what surprised me is after it was published, nobody else continued the research. So in my case, I went back to, since I was based in Manila, I stopped doing travel writing and autobiographical writing for a while. I went back to fiction. And then when I returned to my research on autobiographical writing, I was surprised to find that no other scholars seemed to have followed what I hoped was a new trend, right? Ang akala ko, meron na akong kapalit na nag-aaral din ng Filipino non-fiction by women, wala pa rin. So, I started writing that kind of thing again. I did a lot of criticism, literary criticism of the works of the women writers I admired, like Quirima Polotan, Edith Tiempo, Hilda Cordero Fernando. And then recently I wrote another book which I thought was, I look on as a kind of continuation of my dissertation. And this is, I've forgotten the title of my book.
The newest one, huh?
Yeah, yeah, I remembered it. To remember, I know, to remember, no, which is the study of the memoirs of, I think, 6 Filipino women writers. So, yun, I guess it has become part of my life work to study the work of other women and the lives of other women writers. You know, that book is interesting to me personally. Is that my last book? Yeah, To Remember, because what I set out to do is to find the women of my generation who are still writing today, writing literary work, no? And I found only those 6. Yun. That proves to me that it's not easy to follow that profession. And I was interested in finding out what made them continue writing, even if it was not easy. So that was my project.
Were you, because that book, Filipino Woman Writing, that book is so important for everyone. I mean, for students who are studying creative nonfiction. That's one of the first books that we all turn to. I've talked to all of, not all, but a lot of people who are using CNF as their thesis for their MA. And that's one thing that we all have in common. It's, we use your research as a way to, I don't know, place ourselves within the Philippine literary scene, but that is so important because, like you mentioned, it's the first of its kind, and I'm astounded to know that no one has followed you.
But I thank you for the compliment. It makes me very happy to think that the book was helpful to younger writers, women writers. No, I'm very happy about that. But yes, I do hope that. That other women scholars / writers like yourself and people like Rica Bolipatan, or the younger women who are doing nonfiction, that you will also study the work of your own contemporaries. No? My work already came down to this last book, already includes Rica and Crisel Dayabes, no? Who are of your generation. And I'm sure there are others who are now still writing. One of my mentees, I'm her advisor for her MA thesis, is Sui Valencia of UST. She defended her thesis recently. She has done a memoir on what it's like to be a special person, no? And it's CNF that she has written. I hope you will also turn, aside from writing your own CNF, that you will study the works of your contemporaries so that that work continues. No?
Noted, ma'am. Okay. Where would you, so for scholarship on CNF, that's what you want. Okay. But what about the CNF, memoir writing, or just autobiographical narratives of women in the Philippines, where do you see it going in the next few years?
Well, what I see is a definite increase. That part is, I think, very good news, no? That there are very many more women who are doing. Kasi as I was saying, those writers that I wrote about in the early 90s, I don't think they saw themselves as primarily writers of memoir or creative nonfiction. For example, Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, one of my idols. I want to talk about my idol soon. But anyway, to answer your question, they did not use the name. No? They did not identify themselves as memoir writers or creative nonfiction writers. They wrote essays, they wrote columns, and only I chose a few that I chose to name that way. No? Yes. For me, they were autobiographical narratives. But now, your generation, you're all writing what you call memoirs. So that's a genre accepted now on its own terms. So that's a definite improvement. And I'm so glad that's happening. So in your case, and then Rika, and now Sui, and I have another student in UST who defended her thesis, Katie Wiggins. She wrote an unusual memoir about being she wasn't quite a mail order bride, but she met her husband through the net, which was in my generation unheard of. Wala namang net to begin with. We had what is called pen pals. Yes. We would never have married our pen pals, right? This was just out of the question. That's a new phenomenon, and this young woman, Katie, she wrote about that. So she married he was European, although I forget now which nationality, and her memoir is going to be published by UST. So that's another direction, that memoir writing is taking. I'm wondering if any of the OFWs has written a literary memoir which would take us into a whole new field, no? Because so many of the OFWs were not naman maids here, nor were they, they're working at occupations which may not have been what they were trained for. So I think some of them might be writers. I have just not come across the work of any such women writers, but maybe you, if you do research, might discover them. When I delivered a keynote address in UST last year for the APWT International Conference, someone in the audience was a Dominican priest, the head of our library, the director of our library, Father Angel Aparicio. And he asked me, he didn't ask the question during the forum, but later he wrote me a letter. I was so touched that he bothered to write me a letter. First of all, he's a man, then he's a priest. So I did not expect to get feedback from him, but he said he found my lecture very interesting. But he asked me, why did I limit myself to these particular women? I was explaining that I'm only interested in literary writing, no? I'm not interested in writing that's done by other types of women. Other scholars can study that. My case, I'm really just interested in professional women writers. But he was saying, for example, what about the nuns? Why has nobody found out whether the nuns are doing memoir writing? And I'm like, the nuns? Yeah, but see, I just remembered the legendary story of Eloise and Abelard, the French. Yeah. She was a nun. She was also, however, a philosopher. And she was his student. He was her lover, Abelard, before he became a monk. And she was his student in philosophy. And when he became a monk, he forced her to become a nun. That's a fantastic story. And their letters are wonderful literary pieces. So I'm like, maybe we have an Eloise. So that's somewhere else where you might go. So many of the nuns are also teachers, teachers of literature. I had one such teacher who was very influential in my life, Sister Caritas in St. Paul. It has never occurred to me to ask her, have you written your memoirs or have you kept a diary? But that's one field where you younger scholars might wish to go. No? Yun.
Are you also gonna ask her, did you have a lover before you became a
Ganon?
nun? Yes.
I don't know whether I will go there. Because one thing I have found that Filipino women writers are also very careful about, no? Yeah, I was saying, Dawn, that I have another book that's called 6 Sketches of Filipino Women Writers, no? That's the one pala. Naku, I made a mistake. That's the one that is about the women of my generation. To remember is different, no? It has women from all generations. But the book 6 Sketches is about my contemporaries. I wanted to find out how many of us were still writing. Writers that I started out with at the same time, no? So that includes Sylvia Mayuga and Elsie Coscolluela, Merly Alunan, a few others, no? And I realized when I was interviewing them that there are certain areas where they don't want to go. And one of them is, because several of them are separated from their husbands. And when they talked about their lives, I could see that that part was a troubled part of their lives, but they didn't want to focus on that. So without having to tell me, I knew that they didn't want to emphasize that they had unhappy marriages or that their husbands had in any way made life difficult for themselves. They didn't want to talk about that. So I don't think I would ask a nun whether she had a lover, no? Probably not. So I don't know, in fact, when you do your own research, whether it will be different for your generation, whether you will mind going there, maybe not. Because in To Remember, where I interviewed the younger women, like Rica Bolipata and Criselda Yabes, they were not afraid to talk about that. So they did. And Criselda's memoir is in fact about her failed relationship with her lover of 6 years. No, he abandoned her. And Rica has a successful marriage, no? But she also talked about things which my generation of women would not talk about, like their wedding night, you know, things like that, and much more open about her sexuality and so on. So maybe your generation of women, if you continue studying their work, and if you continue with your own writing, you will explore those areas which my generation felt inhibited about writing about.
But ma'am, do you still feel inhibited to write about those things which you said would probably never make it to your memoir? Because the stories that...
You mean the fiction?
Oh no, ma'am. In your CNF.
Yeah.
CNF. I wanted to ask you if there was a part of your life that you think would probably never make it to your CNF.
Oh yes, most definitely. Yeah, my generation is very inhibited. At least I am certainly, no, and I think many of my contemporaries are. So that, for example, I don't write about my marriage. I think it was a good marriage, no, and my husband passed away in 2011, and we were still married to each other. No? So, however, there are things there that I just would consider too private. So I've not written about them, and I don't know that I ever will. No? And then now, because my children are grown up, my daughters, when I write about them, and in one of my books, for example, Travels with Tanya, I did write about visiting them in their homes in the States. One of them is married and lives in LA. The other one is not married. She lives in Washington, D.C. But when I wrote about my visits to them, I sent them a copy of the pieces that included them. I wanted them to tell me if there was anything there that was uncomfortable for them, or that they felt awkward about, or which were simply there were errors, no, in my memory. So I follow that. No, I belong to that school of writing, that of CNF writing, that believes that you stop where you intrude into the privacy of other people. And therefore, I sent it to them for them to approve or disapprove. And well, as a matter of fact, there was only, I think if I remember correctly, one thing which one of my daughters corrected, and it had to do with the Jewish faith, because my daughter is married to a man of the Jewish faith. So certainly I would not want to offend him or his family, so I changed that part. My other daughter, she did not want, and she did not expect me to change anything. And the later book, To Remember, which is about women's memoirs, beginning with someone who lived in the early Commonwealth period and ending with Rica Bolipata and Criselda Yabes, I also sent what I wrote. I sent it to them for them to approve or disapprove, and they did not naman disapprove of anything. So I think maybe I exercise self-censorship even when I'm doing CNF, even when I'm doing biographical writing. And To Remember is not only CNF, no? It's actually partly literary criticism, right? But I still think of that, you know, like, am I intruding into the privacy of my subjects? And if I am, then I need to clear it with them before I publish it. I have that kind of, I have that kind of restriction, I guess, which I impose on myself. Is that good or bad? I don't know. I have in some open forums, when I speak, been asked, do you not feel that you are therefore only giving half the truth? And my reply to that is, there anyone who's giving all the truth? You know, everything is just a version, right? And in the case of To Remember, I make it very clear that this is my story of my encounter with the work of these women. No? That To Remember is not about personal interviews or their lives. It's only about what they have written. It's about their memoirs. So it's my story of my encounter with their memoirs. So that is, I feel, not an intrusion into their privacy. Since they wrote these works, and I am writing about the work, then it's only about what they wanted known. So wala namang, I feel that I'm not overstepping there.
So I guess that's one of your processes, I suppose, when it comes to revision for your CNF. But what about for your fiction? Is there, like when you're doing revisions, because for younger writers, or for beginning writers, especially me, one of the things that we find most difficult is the revision process. Does it get any easier? Is it something that you actually enjoy?
Okay. I actually was surprised that you said that for you younger writers, revision is one of the most difficult things. No, I'm surprised, and I've been asking myself, well, why is it difficult? Maybe it's the net. I mean, you get so, I don't know, no? Maybe it's the fact that in the net, when you write for the net, you're used to instantaneous publication, no? You write, like in your status reports or your notes, Facebook notes, and then you publish. You just press click, and then it's published. We didn't grow up in circumstances like that, no? When we were apprenticing as writers, I think it was understood that you would have to revise and revise again and again and again. So I don't mind it. I mean, I would be very uncomfortable actually, Don, if I had just written something and then somebody published it. That's why when I speak in forums, in symposia, I take care that it's always, even when I put it on the net, no, sometimes I put it in, I make it a Facebook note, nakalagay dun sa ibabaw, draft, not for publication, because I know it's not ready. And I would, as I said, I would be so uncomfortable if my first draft got published by someone, because I know I will change my mind many times. If you ask me how often do I revise, maybe you will be shocked. Like my novel, 27 times. Yeah, 27 revisions. And I'm talking about the complete novel, not the parts, no? Because Recuerdo, which is my first novel and the most difficult for me to write, there were many false starts. Meaning, I wrote that first as a conventional novel, no? Following a linear development. I had written maybe mga 5, 6, 7 chapters already when I decided it's not working. So I just threw away that draft. And then I began again. And then again, and then again. Hindi ko yung binibilang. When I'm saying 27 revisions, I'm talking about the completed novel already. That I revised completely, turning it into changing the focus. So there was at first it was herself talking to a friend. Then later herself talking to the historian. There's a character there who's a historian, no? So, and then later, dun sa huli na lang, naisip kong gawin ko kayang epistolary. And she will be writing to her daughter. That's a very, very, much later draft. Oh, yeah, and then email, gawin ko kayang email. And even now, I'm not sure that was a good decision, making it email. Because at that time, email was still fairly new. So I was not very familiar with nag-i-email ako, pero, you know, I was not familiar with everything that you can do in email. Wala pa yung mga emoticons, yung mga hyperlinks, yung ganyan, wala. So as it stands now, the novel, which is a series of email messages, I'm not happy with that form now. I would, if I would revise it again, which by the way, I have an agent now, a literary agent. Yeah, we have, that's how far we have gone, no, from when I first started writing. She has suggested to me that I do it over, but as letters. Tanggalin ko na yung, hindi naman longhand, ikaw naman, typewritten letters, computer-generated letters, pero hindi email. Kasi hindi naman nagamit lahat yung mga possibilities and potentialities ng email, no? So wag na lang gawing email. Letters na lang. You know, we assume they were letters sent by snail mail by the mother to the daughter. Kasi that's what they are. I just used the form of email because I wanted, I had this framework of all of this happened within 1 year, no? And snail mail takes long, eh. But I think that's what they really are. So you see that even now that it has already been published, and in fact it won an award, no? It won the Palanca Award for the novel. I'm still not happy with it. So I would like a chance to revise it yet again. But ang papalitan ko yun lang naman, na hindi na siya email, letters na lang sila. But I would retain the whole story and the fact that at the end it turns out it's a novel, no? Being sent to the historian who is a character in the novel. So, yun, I will leave that. But I will change it. Hindi na siya email. So, if that answers your questions about revisions, I don't mind revising. In fact, it has happened to me where nasa printer na, habulin ko pa. Yeah, and then violating my own rules as a publisher naman. As a publisher, first the UP Press Director, then the UST Publishing House Director, I did not allow writers to revise when it's already with the printer. Wala na yon, sobra na yon, no? Pero ako, I have violated my own rules. And I've withdrawn a piece that was already with the printer to make a change that I really believed was important. And as the publisher, the first publisher of F.H. Batacan's novel, Smaller and Smaller Circles, that was published by the UP Press, I also broke the rules for her. Because when we were already ready to print, she called me up and she told me, "Ma'am, may mistake dyan. And it has to do with the science, with the technology of it." Kasi hindi ba forensic anthropologist the main character of Smaller and Smaller Circles is a detective who is a Jesuit priest, a forensic anthropologist. She said she had made a mistake with something to do with the science. And she said, sabi ko sa kanya, "Ichi, I cannot withdraw the novel now, it's with the printer." And then she said, "Ma'am, kung ganon, I know I will offend you, but I will withdraw the novel." Because she said, "I cannot have it published with that mistake." Because that mistake, if one reader alone recognizes that there was a mistake in the science of it, the whole novel falls apart. And I respected that. I thought that is part of her integrity as a writer, so I'll break the rules for her. So we stopped the press literally and gave her back the manuscript so she could make that change. Because I think that's very important as a writer, you know. If you know that nagkamali ka, not about the science of it, but about other things, you should really revise. Yeah, so I'm actually grateful that that we can revise. And I have another book that's its title is Sky Blue After the Rain. That one is my own selection, no? From my different books. I selected the stories that, in a sense, I want to be represented by. I revised everything. So those had been published already in my books, no? Beginning with my first short story collection, which is Ballad of a Lost Season. I included, I think, a couple of stories from there. I revised them for that Sky Blue After the Rain. Everything was revised. And then I included one new story, which was a Patricia Payatot story. Yeah. So, but everything else that had already been published, I revised.
Wow. So every time you see a mistake, you revise right away.
Oh, yeah. Yes. In fact, on the net, I'm crazy. yung mga status report, ni-edit ko yun eh. After it's out already, like kulang ng comma. So babalik ako. Tapos, mali pala, mali ang tense. It should be past perfect tense, not ganon, yung ganyan. Yeah, Facebook notes, I revise and revise and revise. Yeah. And then when I decide to compile into a book, which I did with Stella and other friendly ghosts, that some of the pieces there most of the pieces there were first published as Facebook notes. When I revised everything, really. And I made them longer, I made them shorter, I changed a lot of parts. So I don't know how to use the net the way the younger generation uses it, which is spontaneous, instantaneous. My idea of literature is that it is well-crafted. Kung you publish immediately without revising, it is not well-crafted. By definition, cannot be well-crafted if it is published immediately. It is raw. Parang raw footage. Magpa-publish ba kayo ng footage na, will you release footage that has not been edited? I would think that goes against your own standards of what is a good video or a good film. You have to edit and edit and edit, di ba? So ako, ganyan. That's the way I write. And it's something I want to pass on to my students. Do not release what is hilaw. Kasi you will be known for that. Di ba?
Hopefully, I think that's why we struggle. That's why we struggle with revisions, is because I think all of our, especially you, all of our teachers have emphasized the importance of editing and that it is part of the writing process. It's not just.
I'm glad you think so.
It's just we don't have the discipline that your generation has.
I think you're in
hopefully,
a hurry also. You're in a hurry. Eh? You want to publish na your first book, and then there is pressure to publish the second book, no?
Yes.
And I understand that as well. Your life is more fast-paced, and you don't have the leisure that we did. During my time, of course, there were fewer publishers. The net, of course, did not exist. So in a sense, we are luckier in that sense only, no? That we could afford to take time to revise because no one was in a hurry to publish us anyway. Especially if you were a young writer. The publishers were not interested in you. They wanted to publish Nick Joaquin and the next story by Hilda Cordero Fernando or Greg Brillantes. If you were just starting out, you were a nobody. They were not particularly interested in you. So, but now, because of the net, because of all the creative writing programs and all the creative writing workshops, I'm afraid we are also to blame for it because we do encourage, publish na, pwede na yan i-publish, ganon, ano? Yeah, there's that. So you're living in a different world. So maybe, like the very term naman, instant memoir, right? I've taught you about that and how in my time, young people did not write memoirs because their elders would say, bakit ka naman sumusulat ng memoir? You haven't lived yet. Ano yung ilalagay dun sa memoir, di ba? Whereas today nga, somebody has already coined that phrase, instant memoir, is Larson, because it does happen. And it is actually the blog. The blog which became a big thing during the war in Afghanistan, right? I think that's where it started, where there were the so-called embedded journalists.
Oh, okay.
And then the soldiers themselves who began blogging about their, what they were experiencing right there in the battlefront, right? And people were reading this on the net. The Vietnam War was covered by professional journalists on television. But they did not get yung first-hand account of the soldiers who were being shot at. So, because of that, I think the value of instant writing became obvious to the world, no? And there was an audience for it, and they felt that they were getting a more authentic record than what the journalists were producing. And that changed, I think, the parameters, which is why now the instant memoir has value. People have come to see na, yan namang the one that's passed through the mainstream journalism is not as reliable as the blogs of the people who were right there. And there's a point to that, which is, I think, the validation for the instant memoir. The witness report, it is journalism of a sort, no? Kaya lang, it's literary journalism. Yung instant memoir is not as instant as the blog. The instant memoir has been revised and has been edited. So in a sense, it is not as immediate and as quote-unquote authentic as the blog. But it is more literary. So you make your choice, I guess. No? Which do you wish to be remembered by? Your blog, which is unedited and published as soon as you have finished writing it, or your well-crafted literary memoir.
I think you all know the answer to that. Craft, definitely important. All right, so now let's move from other writers or your contemporary writers here to your literary heroes. Do you, who are these writers that you admire? For fiction and non-fiction.
Okay. Well, let's begin with maybe fiction, no? Because I think all my life I have wanted to be known primarily as a fiction writer, as a writer of fiction, but I found it more difficult to write than non-fiction. No? So I used to want, my MA thesis was on Virginia Woolf. And that was one of my first heroes. No? I wanted to write like her. So I went through a stage of trying to copy her writing style. She and Catherine Mansfield and Elizabeth Bowen. So my early stories, I think, were very much influenced by them. Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, Elizabeth Bowen, and the man who supposedly influenced them, who was Henry James. So if you read my first fiction collection, I think it was published in maybe 1995, or I'm not sure. Dawn, I actually brought one of my books so that I can actually verify whether that's correct or not. Early 90s, no? Ballad of a Lost Season. Those stories are very long. The sentences are very long. Yeah, the rhythm is much more, shall we say, leisurely, much more leisurely than my later stories, because the influences were those writers. So Virginia Woolf, Elizabeth Bowen, Catherine Mansfield, and behind them Henry James. And the Filipino writers, Nick Joaquin. He was, of course, our idol. And like it or not, I think his writing also influenced us, even the women. So they were my idols for my fiction in the beginning. I stopped writing fiction for a while And then when I went back to it, when I had come back from living abroad, my first short story collection after returning to Manila was Tales for a Rainy Night, no? And that's quite different. I think when I wrote that, my idol naman, madaming idols, no, was Isaac Dinson. I was going for that kind of limpid, simple but limpid lyrical quality of Out of Africa. No? Oh, that is nonfiction, but I read all her tales. And that's why Tales for a Rainy Night are tales. I wanted to write modern fairy tales, and she was my model. And without my realizing it, also Hilda Cordero Fernando. So when I wrote those tales, by the way, that's my favorite book. Of all the books I've written, that is my favorite child. Yeah. And yet, they were not difficult to write, strangely. In fact, I think in a way it's my favorite book because the process that I followed when I was writing it was so different. I've never experienced that before, and never since. It was like I had plugged into a source of energy that I had never plugged into before, and the stories just came out. The first story was The Most Beautiful Woman in the Island. Now I know. I wrote them in 1992 because I had just finished teaching in the last UP workshop to be held in Diliman. So that batch was the batch of where they were all really, really gifted and have become very good writers themselves now. Sarge La Cuesta, Vince Groyon, Oreo Solito, Rebecca Año Nuevo, Dean Alfar, I think, was part of that group as well. Chris Martinez. I've forgotten the others. Ang dami nila. Lahat sila magagaling. And then, I think I got inspired partly by that. So I'd been living abroad, so out of touch with the Philippine literary scene, no? With the writers. And then I met these young writers, and they were so good. Rui de Vera was also in that group. Sino pa ba? Mike Corosa. So, sama-sama sila. Ang gagaling nila, both the writers in English and Filipino, the poets and the prose writers. I think I got really turned on. Anyway, the story suddenly started coming, no? So I remember The Most Beautiful Woman in the Island. I was in Baguio with my family. Our hotel room had very poor lights. I was writing in longhand on a notebook. And I couldn't sleep, so I dragged a chair to the bathroom door. I opened the bathroom door because the light in the bathroom was bright. And I wrote on my lap that story, The Most Beautiful Woman on the Island, just like that, dire-diretso until the end. Yun. Then I stopped. Then one day, I got the idea for the next story, and then the next, and the next, ganun. I wrote in the Baguio Country Club while my husband was playing golf, and I had to wait for him. So I was sitting in the terrace of the country club drinking iced tea. And I wrote another story. Ganun lang, straight out. So I don't know what happened. And then I was I wanted to listen to music. And the only kind of music I wanted to listen to was opera music, which I never used to. I mean, I've always liked classical music, but not opera, because it's in Italian, right? So I'm like, I don't understand what they're saying. But the energy and the passion in those opera arias, I was like, I want to listen as I was writing. And then after each story, I was exhausted. And then I'd get an idea for another one. And I was mad at anyone who would talk to me or disturb me or intrude into my life. It was like, leave me alone. I have to finish this. Yun. And when I was done with it, I had no idea if the stories were good or bad. So I submitted one to Greg Brillantes. I forget what magazine it was at that time. After Martial Law na, hindi ko na maalala. Basta kay Greg Brillantes ko, graphic yata, graphic. And then Greg published it. But after he published it, he told me, ayaw mo bang bumalik sa realist writing? So I thought, oh no. Is he trying to tell me that it's no good? And he published it only because he's my friend? Or is he trying to tell me that he doesn't like fairy tales? I had no idea. I was very bothered by it. I truly had no idea whether they were good or bad stories. Because I'd never written fairy tales before. Then I gave the whole lot to Hilda Cordero Fernandez. She was my friend already by then. And then I was so transported when she said, ang gaganda nila. I thought, wow. And then I asked her, will you write an introduction? And she said, no, I will not. Kasi baka sabihin ng mga tao, mas magaling ka sa akin. I knew she was kidding, no? But she said she was not comfortable writing introductions. So she suggested I give them to Amelia Bonifacio, who was, of course, my boss in the Creative Writing Center of UP. And I did give them to her. So she wrote the introduction, and she also praised them. So I knew that some people liked them. But those stories, not one won an award. Huh? When they were published individually, hindi sila nananalo. Kasi ata, the audience thought fairy tale. You know, it's not important. But the book, when it came out, illustrated by Manny Valdebawar, I have to thank Manny for that. When LaSalle published it, no, and then it was Isagani Cruz who said he would publish it. And then I said, Gani, is it okay if I have them illustrated? Sige, sabi niya, sino ang illustrator? Si Manny Valdemor, sabi ko. Tapos sabi niya, naku, I cannot afford to pay him. But I will invite him, let's meet with him. So we did. Manny Valdemor, by the way, was a friend of my husband and myself. We had bought some of his paintings already. So dumating si Manny for the meeting. Sabi niya, yes, definitely, I would be happy to do it. Just let me read it first. Tapos sabi ni Isagani, pero baka hindi ko kaya yung fee mo Manny. Sabi niya, libre lang. Ito lang ang aking request. The paintings belong to me. So you use them and then you return them to me. Okay. Of course, sabi naman ni Isagani. And then I gave, ang ano ko nga medyo arrogante. May listahan ako ng anong klaseng drawing ang gusto ko for each story. Like this scene where she's sitting at a table, drinking a cup of tea, ganyan. Pero nung binigay ko kay Manny, sabi ko, you don't have to follow this. You do what you want. I'm sorry, no. I did not know that you would agree. I thought I would be working with a younger artist and then pwede ko i-pressure yung artist na ganito yung gawin mo. Pero it's yours. You do it whatever you want. You know, to my amazement, he followed it. So he illustrated each story, 3 illustrations per story, plus the cover. And I thought, you know nga, I thought it was exactly what I wanted, what I dreamt of for that book, no? And then, di tapos na, na-publish na. And we launched it in the Hardin ng mga Diwata. And I told the organizers, I forget sino ba nag-launch noon? I think it may have been si LaSalle Publishing House. Si Isagani. Sabi ko sa kanya, ayoko nung usual book launching na maraming speeches, maraming ganyan, ayoko ng ganyan. Gusto ko doon lang sa garden. Party lang talaga. Tapos may kakanta. Si Mike Corosa. Kasi he sang kundimans, no? Doon sa workshop, I was so impressed. Kasi he would sing kundiman. Meron pang background, sasabihin niya kung saan ba yung tinugtog for the first time, sino ang kumanta, ganyan, may history. So, pumayag naman si Mike. And then si Sarge Lacuesta, who was a rocker. He was the lead singer for his band, rock band. I don't remember what the rock band was. He was, at the time, he had just graduated from BS Biology, and he was in medical school of UP. He came also, and he sang a song that he had composed for me, for that occasion. So yun lang, he sang one song, na ballad siya, hindi rock, no? But he was a rocker. Pero the whole evening, it was Mike who was singing. Hinaharanahan niya ako, diba? And then at some point during the party, nilapitan ako ni Franz Arcellana. Sabi niya, Jean, when is this program going to start? Akala niya, meron the usual program na may speeches. Baka nga he was expecting that he would be asked to speak. So Sabi ko, this is it, France. It's just a party. Sabi niya, okay, then I will go and get food. And so that is my favorite book. That is my favorite launching. It's a high point in my life.
It's amazing that your book is, it's a mix of course, literature, music, and also painting.
Yeah. And recently in UST, I don't know if you remember, Dawn, I think you were not yet connected with the center in UST. We had an affair, an activity called Brushes with Words and Chords, yeah. And Richie Guevara, of course, the poet, put it together. She had artists come and illustrate she asked the writers to select one of their works. Then she gave these works to artists from the College of Fine Arts to make a painting of, and then there was music also played. In my case, I asked to display that book, and then I lent them a couple of the, kasi this is, hindi pa pala tapos yung kwento. Nung nalabas na nga, and it was a success, it won an award, I asked Manny, how much will you charge me if I buy the cover? May I buy the painting that you used for the cover? Yeah. And then sabi niya, usually hindi ko binibenta yung mga painting na ginamit sa mga libro kasi that is in another kind of category. He says the prices of the paintings increase if they are used to illustrate books. So, tanong niya, kailan ba ang birthday mo? Nagkwentuhan lang kami, and then tinanong niya, kailan ba ang birthday mo? And then I told him, and then kwentuhan ulit kami. So akala ko, no, right? I'm not going to sell the painting. So, well, I accepted it. And then on my birthday, I got the whole set.
Oh, even all of the
all. He sent me all the paintings. All the illustrations plus the cover with a card saying, Happy Birthday.
Oh!
Yeah.
Where are the paintings?
Some are hanging in my office in UST. Some are in my house, in my townhouse in Gilmore. I have, unfortunately, 2 were burned in the faculty center fire, in UP. But I have the rest of the set. So, yeah, it's very meaningful, the whole thing in my life. Yeah. So, as I was saying, for that activity of the UST Center, yun ang binigay ko, yung libro na yun, yung 2 painting ni Manny. And then someone I was asked to read a passage. I chose a passage from the most beautiful woman in the island, and somebody turned it to music from the College of Music. So even today, it's a very special book for me, but it's out of print now. De La Salle made it an e-book, so I think it is available now online. Haba ng kwento, no? Ikli ng tanong.
But did you ever get to meet any of your literary idols in person?
Yeah, I met, well, of course, Nick Joaquin, no? I got to meet him, of course, because eventually one of my stories was accepted by Nick Joaquin. This is, you remember I was saying in my early years as a writer, I could only write 1 story a year, right? So, for that particular year, I think it was 1972, and I'll tell you later why I remember it. I wrote a story, no, actually in 1971, I wrote a story called Ballad of a Lost Season, and I submitted it to Nick for the Free Press. At the time, he was the literary editor of the Free Press. And it was returned to me with a note saying, this story should be cut by 2/3. I was heartbroken because I thought it was my best story, you know. So, and by the way, I considered myself lucky that he bothered to write, because during those days, the editors did not answer. You submitted something, and then you never heard. If you never heard from them again, that means they threw it into the waste can. Or one day you would see it published na. So, yung na may sinulatan pa niya ako, I was very grateful. But I thought, cut by 2/3. I didn't think I would do it or could do it. I guess at the time I was also at the stage that you're describing, that I didn't want to revise. It hurt me to have to cut parts of my story, but I did. And the next year, I submitted the story again, already cut by 2/3, and he published it. So I thought, wow, that means I have a chance to win the Free Press Award. You remember sa Free Press, like the graphic now, so long as your story is published, it becomes a contender for the Short Story Awards. So I thought, yun, baka naman ako manalo, di ba? And then martial law was declared. That's why I remember it was 1972, because the Free Press was closed down, as were all the media, the Philippine media, by Marcos. So my story never had a chance to win the Free Press Award. But it is part of my, my book, Ballad of a Lost Season. My idols, you were asking. My literary idols. So I met Nick Joaquin because he published my story. And I went to the Free Press to collect my pay. And I met him. And then I met him again and again afterwards. No? Hilda Cordero Fernando, another idol, became my personal friend. I couldn't believe it. Sometimes I would, as I was on my way to her house, I would think, am I actually friends with Hilda Cordero Fernando? The other one, Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, my friend was her daughter, the Miss International, the first Filipina Miss International, Gemma Cruz Araneta. So I met Chitang, Mrs. Nakpil, because of Gemma. And when Gemma won, I was then writing for the Philippine Graphic. I had just graduated. Gemma is my contemporary. We are exactly the same age. So when she won, she had just graduated from college, and I was writing for the Philippine Graphic. So I was assigned by my boss to interview her in her house. And then when I arrived, Nick Joaquin was there interviewing Gemma's mother, Chitang Nakpil, because she had a very important role in Gemma's winning. She coached her and a lot of things. So while I was interviewing Gemma, I was actually listening to Nick Joaquin interviewing Chitang Nakpil. But we were in awe of Chitang. She was the best Filipino essayist, we thought. And she was a very intimidating, glamorous, sophisticated woman. So I remember one time we were attending some conference or other, Sylvia Mayuga and I. And then I said to her, Sylvia, nandiyan na si Chitang. So we turned to her, and then Sylvia said to me, shall we genuflect? Because she was for us really a saint. Yeah, I got to meet her personally. Kerima Polotan, I also got to meet when I published with Focus magazine that she was editing. I was scared of Kerima. She had the reputation of being a difficult woman, a temperamental woman. But she was, I admired her completely. Later, her daughter became my student in UP. And I won an award. Something I submitted to Focus won an award. And I'm very grateful to Kerima for another reason. Focus magazine was one of the few magazines to open after martial law was declared, and the only one carrying literary selections. So I got a chance to be published again after martial law was declared because of Kerima. So I'm very grateful about that. And many, many years later, I got the opportunity to repay the favor when I was working for the UP Creative Writing Center at the time with Jimmy Abad as director. He launched this Likhaan series, literary series, in collaboration with the UP Press, which at the time was headed by Laura Samson. And I suggested to him that we reprint all of Kerima's works. And he said yes. So we asked permission from Kerima. She gave her permission, and we reprinted all her works. And when we were going to launch them, I remember asking her daughter, Kimi, who was my student, will your mother come to the launching? And she said, I don't know. You know, she has become reclusive. This was long after martial law na, no? The 90s na. Kerima stopped writing after martial law. I think she and her husband were affiliated with the Marcoses. So I think she thought that she would no longer be welcomed by the literary community. So I asked Kimi whether Karima would come to the launching. She said she wasn't sure. And then she came. So I met her at the door, and she took my hand and said, "Jean, I came because of you." So I thought, oh, this is my reward, right? So that answers your question about my Philippine idols. I also got the opportunity to meet a few of my foreign idols. I met A.S. Bayat, yeah, and Doris Lessing, the Nobel Prize winner, along with several other British writers in a conference on British contemporary literature in Cambridge University, held by the British Council. So I was a fellow sponsored by the British Council on the recommendation of Jimmy Abad. So I went to Cambridge, and that's another high point of my life, yeah, because I met Terry Eagleton and Margaret Drabble, and the detective story writer, the woman, P.D. James, I think, and several poets, Andrew Motion and Simon Armitage. But for me, the hype, and David Lodge. But the high point was A.S. Bayat, whom I totally worship, and Doris Lessing. So when I met them, I'm like, is this happening? And most recently, the biggest one of them all, Mario Vargas Llosa, right? Who came to UST to speak. Would you believe, at my invitation? Shall I tell you that story? Yeah, in 2013, I was already director of the UST Center for Creative Writing, and Mario Vargas Llosa. See, when I was starting to teach again in UP, I was, I think, the first person to teach Latin American fiction. Did you take that course with me? You did not? Okay. Anyway, in UP. So the Latin American writers were only beginning to be read in the Philippines at that time. Actually, the so-called Latin American boom began only in the 60s. No? They were discovered by this press in Spain called Seis Barral. And they gave this award, the Premio Brava. And Mario Vargas Llosa was one of the first, if not the first, to win it. And then it happened to be, luck played a role in it. No? It happened to be a time when the European novel was in the doldrums. And then they discovered Llosa and Marquez and all these Latin American writers. And they were immediately translated into English. So they became big-time stars. Anyway, the year that Llosa won, so I was teaching those guys, in other words, at the time when very few people knew of them, and I was so enamored of them, really. Llosa was my favorite, because each novel is different from every other novel. So when he won the Nobel in 2010, I moved to UST in 2010. That's when I retired from UP and was hired by UST to head the publishing house. No? And then later I was moved to revive the Creative Writing Center. I approached the rector, who's my boss, and then I asked him, if I were to be able to invite Mario Vargas Llosa to come, ambisyosa, no? Would you be willing to spend for it? And he's like, yes, I would, definitely. And we will give him an honorary professorship. And besides, sabi niya, I know the Vice President of Peru, or the former Vice President of Peru, so you can write to him. So this is what I did. I wrote to this person whom Father Rector, Father Dagohoy knew, asking for his help to invite Mario Vargas Llosa to lecture in UST and to be given this award. I mean, this honorary professorship. Okay. I didn't hear from them in 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. So 2014, I get a letter from the Department of Foreign Affairs, our Department of Foreign Affairs, saying that the letter was received by Mario Vargas Llosa and he is happy to accept the invitation, except that he cannot come this year. But if you can arrange for a later date, he may be able to come. And then she gave me his address, the lady who wrote to me. She was Secretary of American Affairs in our DFA. So I wrote to Mr. Vargas Llosa. I never heard from him again. So I thought, yeah. Yeah, I kind of gave up on it. I tried one more time, no answer, so I gave up. And then this year, I heard from our national artist, Frankie Sionil Jose, because I'm a member of PEN, that Mario Vargas Llosa was coming to the Philippines because he was going to visit the family of Isabel Preisler, his girlfriend. So I'm like, really? So I called my friend in the Instituto, Cervantes, Jose Maria Fons, to ask him if there would be a possibility to ask him to come to UST. And he said, no, I'm afraid not. He's here on a personal visit. He will only appear in the Instituto and in La Salle, which is his alma mater, and will give him a PhD honoris causa. Okay, so talagang not meant to be. Then about 3 weeks before he finally arrived, I got a telephone call. I was in the hospital in Philippine Heart Center. My daughter was confined. So my cell phone rang and I replied, hello, ganyan pa, masungit. Hello, sabi niya, this is Carlos Madrid. Yes, what can I do for you? Sabi ko naman, oh yeah, who you? He said, I am the director of the Instituto Cervantes. Do you remember writing a letter to Mario Vargas Llosa inviting him to the Philippines? And I'm like, yes. Why? Well, he has gotten in touch with us and he says he would like to honor the invitation. Imagine. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, so he says, and then he says, are you still interested? Yes. Yes, we are. So later, I heard from the Spanish ambassador that he, in fact, asked them to schedule his visit to UST first, and then La Salle, because we had invited him first. So he did come, right? I attended a press conference. In the press conference, I was too nervous to actually talk to him, to approach him. I just asked a question. No? I asked him, I said, I'm a teacher, and I teach your novel. If you were to choose 3 only of all your novels that you would suggest that I teach to introduce Filipinos to your work, what would those 3 novels be? And he answered, it's very difficult, you have no favorites among your children, but I think I would choose the ones that were hardest to write. So he said, The Conversation in a Cathedral, The War of the Two Worlds, and The Storyteller, which for me was such a delight because that's my favorite, The Storyteller. And then he explained why they were so difficult to write. Anyway, that is my first encounter with him. When he came to UST, and I was introduced to him, was it the ambassador or maybe it was Mr. Madrid who said, she's the lady who sent you the invitation. And then, so I got to talk to him a little more during that visit. And then the night before he left Manila, I was invited, Father Richard Ang, our vice rector, because our rector is out of the country. So the one who gave him the honorary degree was the vice rector, Father Richard Ang. And Father Ang has asthma. So he said he could not go to that dinner that the Spanish ambassador was giving in honor of Mr. Vargas Llosa and Miss Preisler. So he asked me to go in his place. So again, I couldn't believe this was going to happen. And then he asked me, can you ask him to autograph this book that I bought? Because I was not able to line up with everybody. Remember, during the visit in UST, people had to line up to be entitled to get his autograph, and only 50 were honored. So I brought the book with me to the dinner of the ambassador, and I was thinking baka hindi siya, it's not a very diplomatic thing to do, maybe it's against protocol, I wasn't sure. But when we were standing there, it turned out to be a very private dinner with just the family of Miss Preisler and the president of De La Salle, which had also honored him, and me,
Yes.
and one other person who was not part of the family, the Dexter Vibal, the owner of Vibal Publishing, which I think does a lot of work with Instituto. Anyway, we're standing having cocktails, so I decided, okay, make or break. So I just approached him, and in a moment when he wasn't talking to anybody, and said to him, "Do you remember me?" And he's like, "Of course." He said, "I was so, delighted with the ceremony in UST, etc., etc." And then I said, "Do you remember Father Richard Ang?" And he said, "Yes, he did." So I asked him, "Would you be willing to autograph this?" Because he was not able to line up. And he said, of course, let's go to that other room and I will. So I had this this tete with Mario Vargas Llosa for about maybe 10 minutes, where after he signed, we talked a little. I told him about, because he said something like, "I am so surprised and pleased to find out that I have readers in the Philippines." So I told him about my experience of teaching him and The Greenhouse, which is what I first taught. And he's like, "Oh, that's a difficult novel. Why did you start with that one?" Ganon. Then I said that I was very impressed with his saying that, actually impressed by his humility when he said that he thought he did not have talent. Yeah, he said when he was a young person, because somebody asked a question about when you were young, did you expect you would be so successful? And he said, when I was young, writers never even thought of success. Success was not a word in our vocabulary, no? Sabi niya, when we did not have publishers, we did not have readers, with no critics, so no publishing houses. So I was very lucky, he said. And I said, well, we're in that sort of situation here. And then he said, I don't think so. I think you, if I understand correctly from what I've seen, you have a very active cultural life here. And I said, well, we do. And some of the other arts are flourishing, like painting. You know, we are sold at auction now, some of our artists. But we writers, we still do not, cannot earn a living. Yeah, as writers. And he said, well, yeah, that will take a little longer. And then I said, you also said that even now, every time you start a new novel, you worry again about whether you have the talent. Yes, sabi niya, every time I start writing, I don't know whether I can make it. So I was very impressed with that humility. Anyway, in answer to your question of whether I actually met my idols, okay, I've been lucky to meet those Filipino writers that I so admire, and then Miss Bayat, Miss Lessing, and Mr. Mario Vargas Llosa. So, yeah, I have.
Very lucky to have
Very
met
lucky, yeah.
all of them. After meeting Llosa, do you feel like adding another novel to your
Writing
collection?
another novel.
Yes.
Myself?
Yes.
Writing another novel myself?
Yes.
I have been trying to write a third novel for some time and failing. I'm still trying. Yes, I would like to write another novel, and I know this will sound like an excuse, but Butch Dalisay will tell you the same thing, and all other novelists. It's so hard because none of us are full-time writers, right? And when you write a novel, because it's an extended work, you have to live in that world, right? When you're writing a novel. You know, like when you write a short story, you have to live in that world. But the short story will be finished in, at most, maybe months, no? But a novel will take much longer. And as you continue, every time you begin to write again, every time you return to the book, you have to read it from the beginning so that you can enter the novel's world at that point where you stopped. So it's very difficult to remain focused. And I've not been able to do it, which is why what I've been writing of late have been, again, essays, yes, memoirs. So I have no answer to that. Will I be able to write a third novel? Yeah, but I did not need Mario Vargas Llosa's how many novels? 30 ba or 40 or what? To make me want to write, I do. And I'm so envious of Crip Yuson, who has just finished his third novel, and of course Charleston Ong, who has, I think, 4 now. Yeah, I so envy them. And I do hope to write another novel. Maybe it's something different from my last 2.
Ma'am, how would you describe your writing style?
My writing style, well, as I was saying, it changed. No? So when I started out, I think my style was a little different. Well, first there's a difference between the style that I use for the fiction and the nonfiction. Yes, I think so. I think that when I'm writing nonfiction, what I have in mind is that what I'm having is a conversation with, it's like I'm making cuento, no, to the reader or to whatever, someone, and so it's a more casual, more comfortable sort of voice. Well, comfortable is not the right word for it. Maybe just casual, more casual conversational style that I go for. I don't think it's even conscious. I think when I sit down and I start writing what is a travel essay or a memoir, then it's a different persona that I inhabit, which is closest to what I really am, I think. And I'm thinking of, what is in my mind is that the situation is a visit with someone whom I'm chatting with, something like that. For fiction, the voice changes depending on what kind of story it is, right? So that's the main difference. No? When you're writing fiction, you're not necessarily the persona. There's a narrator, so whom you invent, and that narrator may be very different from you, might be a man or so on. No? In terms of language, the kind of language used, I believe that what I'm trying for is what I described a little earlier as kind of simple, limpid lyricism. That's what I try for. I think of fiction as, especially the tales. When what you're writing is a tale, you're trying to weave a kind of spell, a kind of magical spell, and part of, I mean, one of the tools, or maybe the only tool that you're using, is words, right? So that the way you put words together, how there is a kind of rhythm to it, and the sort of images that you work with must all contribute toward creating that kind of spell. So that's the style that I use for my short stories, which are tales. The novels are a little different. No? So I think the style that I used for Recuerdo was quite different from the style I used for A Book of Dreams. But on the whole, yeah, on the whole, that's what I go for, a kind of simplicity. I don't want to be difficult to access by the reader. Although I think that A Book of Dreams is difficult for another reason, not the language, but the structure. And the whole plan is a little more complex, no? Which is not really what I'm most comfortable with. It was an experiment, actually, A Book of Dreams. Catch a Falling Star is closer to my nonfiction style. Yeah, so that's it. That's the best I can do about describing my style.
So your style changes depending on the genre that you're writing in. Is there any, so you write criticism, fiction, and nonfiction. Is there any genre that you would like to maybe try writing in?
Just add a little to what you were saying. No? I do write criticism, and I do consider myself a literary scholar. I think you have to if you are a teacher of literature. But the kind of criticism that I do is close to creative nonfiction. In fact, my most recent work is what I call a mongrel form. No? I don't like the very, I never use jargon, the critical jargon, and I don't like to sound pedantic. So I try to, when I'm doing criticism, the voice I assume is the voice of the teacher in a classroom who's just, having a conversation with her graduate students. And so it's not literary criticism of the sort that we generally read when we're reading literary analysis, right? Which is very, very theoretical and technical even. I don't write that kind of criticism. No. So I'm more comfortable with this. I don't know, I don't say I invented it. I think other writers certainly do it. I know A.S. Bayat does. Just criticism which is also, in a way, narrative. And then, now, what is there a genre I would like to try? I did try drama. I wrote one play. It was not good, I think. I'm a good enough teacher to know when what I'm writing is not good. I think if there's one thing I have, it's self-knowledge about my own talents or lack of them. And I've also tried to write poetry, and I'm not any good either. So I think that's it. I'm not going to go on trying any of that. I write creative nonfiction, which could be memoir or literary journalism even, and I write fiction, and that's it.
One of the largest bodies of writing that you have is the travel essay, right? What advice would you give for a writer who would like to write well when it comes to writing about a place?
Yeah. First of all, I think the travel writer today has got to be very aware of the fact that the net has changed the parameters of travel writing. When the earliest travel writing was in the nature of exploration of places that other people had not visited, right? The first travel writers were the chroniclers that went with the explorers of the age of, you know, the imperial age, no? When they were, Europe was setting up its colonies and discovering the new world, they always had chroniclers who went with them, right? And those chroniclers were the first travel writers. So that was the idea behind it, no? It was new knowledge. It was discovery of places unknown and wondrous. And that sort of continued to be the parameters until travel became much easier, right? So travel writers had to find places which were not they were away from the beaten path to sound interesting. No? Today, that is out of the question. Like when I first wrote about Beirut, none of my friends had ever been to Beirut. So they were like, Beirut? Why would you go there, right? And so on. But, and then Rangoon, you know, Mandalay, Pagan, what's that? Why do you want to go there? Why don't you go to Disneyland, right? But now, of course, anywhere has been visited by any number of people, and people pretend to go there too through the net by stealing things that other writers have written, putting them together. We all know that's going on, right? So there's no place in this planet anymore, I think, that has not been visited. So if you're going to do travel writing today, you need to be, first of all, aware of that. And that there's nothing new that you can say, no place that is new that you will discover. So your writing, your travel writing will stand and fall by what your insight might be into places that other people have already been to. So it will be more of your own personal encounter with the place. The insights that you provide, you can't expect to be providing information or stuff like that. No? So it is a challenge, but then all good writing is like that. No? You can say that of even fiction. What plot is it that has not been used by other writers before, right? So in a sense, it is always your insight that you offer rather than anything that's new. So that is, I think, what you need to remember, all travel writers today. The rest is, you know, technique. I mean, you know how to, of course, describe places, capture not just the visual experience, but the auditory, the sense of smell has to be working, the sense of touch. But that's technique. You can pick that up, right? Very important is attitude, I think. What is your attitude as you take the reader on this journey with you? What does that journey represent for you? And what have you, because there's the physical journey in space, and then there's the inner journey that the persona is encountering or experiencing as he or she experiences the place. So how significant is that inner journey? Are our readers going to be able to relate to it or be enchanted by it, seduced by it?
Which place have you written about has left an indelible mark on you? Because you talked about how in travel writing it's all about your personal encounter with the place, right? What place has been so memorable for you?
It would have to be one of those places where we actually lived, no? Because the places that I just visited, I don't think they left indelible memories. I mean, meron din naman, like, for example, Cambridge University, no, is so meaningful to me because of the people that I met there and the kind of event that it was. No? It was so extraordinary for me. But usually when you travel as a tourist, in my case anyway, I wouldn't say that any of the places have left indelible marks, really. So I would have to be choosing from among the places where I actually lived. And then, now that you asked the question, I find that I can't choose from among them. I think each one left its mark. I would say that the city I feel most at home in, next to Manila, is Bangkok. And the reason, I think, is because it was the first posting for my husband. So it was my first experience of living away from Manila, and I was happy there, and it was like discovering the rest of the world for the first time. So it was like a door that opened into a new stage in my life. So every time I go to Bangkok, I'm happy. Beirut, because it was so strange and it was at war, and it was so hard, you know, to live there, where there were bullet holes in the bedroom window of my children, yeah. One time a bullet just came crashing in while they were asleep, and it landed on the floor beside her slipper. So in the morning, she woke us up. This was my little girl of about 3 or 4. She's like, Mommy, there's the window in the room is all broke. And then I came in and I saw there was glass all over her blanket and on the floor, and then there was a bullet right beside her slipper. So that was the kind of place that was. And there was a bullet hole in our car. So that kind of place will leave an indelible mark on you. And also, it was so beautiful. The city itself was so beautiful. But then again, there's Seoul, where maybe I was most fulfilled. I taught in a university that I loved. First I taught in Seoul National University, which is the counterpart of UP. I would have to drive nearly out of town to the foothills of a mountain where their campus was. But my main job was in Sogang University, which was the counterpart of Ateneo, the Jesuit university. I had a very nice time there. I enjoyed my years there. And I had a column in the Korea Times, so I was fulfilled. No? I was diplomat's wife on the one hand, and attending all kinds of social functions. And I made a lot of Korean friends, which made me be able to enter Korean society in ways which foreigners usually cannot. But at the same time, I had a job which I found very fulfilling. So that's also left a mark on me and led to a book all about Korea. And then Burma, oh my, Myanmar. Maybe that's the one, because aside from being very different from, I think every place I lived in was different from the last one, no? But we stayed longest in Burma. And then they had their own people power while we were living there. So I was evacuated from Burma with my first experience of being evacuated by the U.S. Marines.
Oh, wow,
because because the revolutionaries had closed down the airport. The planes were no longer flying, and the UN and the Red Cross brought in planes to evacuate the last foreigners left in Burma. Yeah. Actually, Thailand sent a Thai interflight for ASEAN nationals, and the ambassador called up Tony to tell him, your family can be evacuated, because Tony would stay behind. No? UNICEF went into emergency operations, so he stayed behind. But he was evacuating me and Carmen, our youngest daughter. The two were living in Manila at the time. But Tony didn't want us to ride on the Thai interplane with the other ASEANs because he said it would be demoralizing for his staff if his family were to leave ahead. So he wanted us to leave with the UN families, which was the last flight with the Red Cross. So by the time we boarded, there were no more employees of the airport, so the Marines took over. And they brought this staircase, which did not reach, it was too short for the plane that the Red Cross had sent. No, the US Embassy had sent that plane. So the last step, there was like a gap like this between the ladder or the steps and the plane. So the Marines were, helping us up, and there were Marines on the plane pulling us up like that. So my little girl, they had to lift her like that, and me, they had to pull me up. So, but it was exciting. And my daughter, she wasn't scared. She thought it was exciting. When she heard we were going to be evacuated, she even said to me, "Oh, Jima, you'll miss all the excitement. You won't be able to write about it." Because she knew I was taking down notes the whole time, that they were having demonstrations every day. This is the People Power Revolution, which, however, ended very badly because the army, they fired at the unarmed citizens, and so many were killed, students. This was after we had left. And Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the symbol of their struggle, was put under house arrest, where she remained for years. No, I got to interview Aung San Suu Kyi. I was, in fact, the last foreign journalist to interview her. That was carried by the Inquirer, that story. And so that country left its mark on me, certainly. I greatly admire their courage and their ability to survive the really, really bad times. And then we lived in New York City, and that's another kind of experience, which another part of me was in love with, but one part of me hated, because I think I got there at the wrong time. I think New York City is a place for young people. And when I got there, I was not a young person anymore. So there were things about it I didn't like. But of course, the MoMA, Strand Bookstore, the theater, that's excitement all by itself, right? New York City is in some ways it is the center of the world. And this was before 9/11, so anyway, yeah, so the long and short of it is I cannot choose. Among the places that I just visited, the one that's most memorable to me is Kathmandu. Not just because it's so enchanting, with the mountains and so on, but because People Power in the Philippines happened while I was there. My husband was attending a meeting, and I was there as a tourist, and we could not contact our daughters here when People Power happened. So it's very strange time. I've written about it, but of the places that I just visited, I'd say Kathmandu, and of the places where I've lived in, all. I was changed by living in those places.
Always away from home.
Yeah.
Let's move now to home. Could you talk about when you were born? Is there any kind of like a special story to it when you were born? Yes.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I was born during the war, during the last year of the war, 1944. So we were approaching the worst part of the war because the Americans were making a push for retaking Manila. So during the Battle of Manila, I was a newborn baby, right? My mother almost died because of dysentery. And then I got dysentery because she had no milk, so they had to give me powdered milk, and maybe the water was contaminated, so I almost died. And the doctors of PGH kept it open until the last minute, when the city was on fire. Only then did they close. Doctors were very, very brave. But, and all of this was just told to me, obviously. I was a newborn baby. I required blood transfusion. And there was no blood in the hospital. Fortunately, my pediatrician had the same blood type as me. His name is Dr. Quintos. And he is the father of the writer Melinda Quintos de Jesus. And her daughter, the daughter of Melinda is another writer, Noel de Jesus. So when I met Melinda, when we were both already, starting our career as writers, I said to her, you and I are sisters in a way, because your father's blood is in my veins. He saved my life. Later on, he saved my daughter's life as well, but that's another story. Anyway, that's interesting about my birth. Much later, in fact, only recently, when I was writing what I hope will be my memoirs, I was wondering why I was such a timorous child. I was afraid of everything, I would cry. My parents would be late picking me up from some children's party. I would be frightened and would cry. Matakutin na bata, a scaredy cat. And I wonder whether it might have been, now that we know what we know about life in the womb, to think that while my mother was carrying me, it was through the worst times. They got married during the war, my parents. And then they lived through that terrible battle for Manila. I was an infant. I was carried by my family. They were 4. My mother is from Quiapo. My father is from Tondo. When they got married, they lived in Paco, so Manila talaga. My mother has a sister who lived with her. And it should have been a double wedding when they got married, because my aunt was engaged to the best friend of my father. They were both from LaSalle, classmates in LaSalle. But the fiancé of my aunt joined the guerrilla movement. My father was not accepted by the army. He tried to enlist, but something wrong with his lungs, so he was not accepted. And then anyway, the Americans left, right? So they abandoned the Philippines. His best friend joined the underground. So he told my aunt, I should not marry you first because they might use you to get to me. So she was living with my mother and my Lola. The two of them moved to my parents' house in Paco. Then they got word from I'll tell you his name so I don't have to keep saying my aunt's fiancé. His name was Manoling, our Tito Manoling. He sent word to my aunt that the Japanese were going to zone off, SONA ang tawag, no? Magsosona sa Maynila. Diyan sa inyo, sa Paco. So come to me in Taft, so you will be safe. So my family, carrying me and one bag of diapers, I think, and milk, tried to reach Taft Avenue on foot. No? Yung pala doon ang SONA. So it was the wrong information. It was the Ermita Malate area that's where the Japanese chose to make their last stand. So my parents couldn't go in. That's what saved our lives, because later we heard that house where Manoling lived, and you know how, well, anyway, it was one of those houses where the neighbors sought shelter. His father was a judge and a kind man, so he asked his neighbors to come. They were sheltering in that house where my tito, who was a guerrillero, was. The Japanese entered that house and killed everyone. They massacred everyone, except for one houseboy who was saved because he like a corpse fell on him. And so he survived, right? He was the one who ran from there to my parents' house to tell them what had happened. Many, many years later, I found a diary when I was working on my book, Pinay, which is an anthology of autobiographical writings by women. Somebody gave me this unpublished diary in Spanish about 3 days under the Japanese regime. It's a story of the battle for Manila. She was a neighbor who had been also invited to go to that house. This is the Del Rosario family. And it was so crowded, she could not sleep. So she left She figured I will go back to my own house and sleep there and then return. When she left is when the Japanese attacked. So they could hear the gunfire, they could hear the screams. And when they returned, almost everyone was dead, but some were still alive. And they could not do anything to help them because the Japanese were still burning the city and killing everyone they saw. So that was a nightmare. And my aunt never married. But as I was saying, when I was growing up, a very timid child, I wondered whether it wasn't the effect of having lived through all that, first as a fetus inside my mother, and then later as a baby who lived through those horrific days where I may have absorbed the terror that my family felt as they were running, from church to house to, out in the open, corpses all around them. So, maybe that's why I'm a coward. No, but I think that accounts perhaps for my having been such a timorous, timid child and physically quite frail, actually. But, for some reason, we survived and lived to tell the tale, right? Anyway, that's the interesting story about my birth.
Not just interesting, it's very
and many years later,
our history.
And this is the thing. My aunt died of cancer when I was already married. My sister and I were already married. And I was not there, but my mother tells me that she died at home and she had a very, very terrible kind of cancer. But she didn't want to go to the hospital anymore. So she was at home and she died. And then the oxygen, naubos yung oxygen that she was attached to, so she had a difficult time. But as she was dying, her face suddenly lit up and she called out his name.
Oh,
yeah, she said, Manuling. And then she died. So it's like he was there as she was dying. So anyway, that's a story there. I thought I would someday write about it, and I did include it as part of Recuerdo. I think it's in there somewhere, yeah. That was a real story based on my family. Many of the stories in Recuerdo are based on the memories of my family and my friends. So, yun. Yeah.
Would you consider Recuerdo as your best work or the work that you're proudest of? Because we already know your favorite child, right? So,
I'm proudest of.
Is it Recuerdo or some other book?
I think it's the work that I spent the most time with. It was the most difficult to write. As I said, I did it over many times, partly because it was my first novel, partly because I was trying to tell a story that was not easy to tell since it's several generations of one family, right? And I wanted to be faithful to it. I felt I owed it to my family. Oh, by the way, I have to tell you this. I just found out something new so one of my ancestors, one of my earliest ancestors, is Padre Jose Guevara. So, yeah, I know, a priest. He was the parish priest of Quiapo. That's the only thing I knew about him. So when I wrote the novel, the only thing that I knew about him was that he was the parish priest of Quiapo. And then my mother only knew his last name, Padre Guevara. They did not know what had happened to him, only that he disappeared at some point in the life of my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, and that she had 3 children by him, and later she married a Spaniard. So the mystery of that priest was not resolved, until, well, actually, when I was working on the novel, I met, I think after the novel was already published, I met this Dr. Luciano Santiago, who is a psychiatrist actually. He was the psychiatrist of my nephew, my sister's son. But he's also a archivist and a historian by vocation. And he knew that story because I think he read my novel. And then he told me, I know who that priest is, and I will give you something I have on him. So he had a, I don't now remember where it comes from. It's like biographical notes with a photograph of that priest. So I found out that his name was Father Jose Guevara, and that he was part of the Katipunan, meaning he was with the Gomburza, those heroes. He was part of that movement, except that he was not executed. So maybe he was not as involved as those three who were martyred, but he was arrested and sent into exile in the Marianas, which is why he disappears from the history of my family. They had no idea what happened to that priest. The history that they know of in my family, and this is in my novel, Recuerdo, is that that woman, his girlfriend, his mistress, then married a Spaniard. So our family has two lines. No? There are those who look like me, more or less Pinoy and Chinese. And then there's this family who all look very, very mestizo. So we're like, what happened there, right? Well, we know that that woman married the Spaniard and that she had children by the priest. And I belong to that side. So the priest disappeared, right, from the life of his wife, his mistress. And then the two boys, one went to Bataan and married there. The other one was a violinist. So that's where the artistic gene comes from. This is in my novel, actually, and married an actress, a zarzuela actress, the leading lady of his company. And they went to Naga. They uprooted themselves from the city and settled in Naga. And there he set up his zarzuela company with his wife. And my Lola, my maternal grandmother, is a child of that couple. That man was arrested and shot in Bagumbayan for belonging to the Katipunan. That son of the priest, he was martyred. So his widow took her children and gave them to her brother-in-law who had settled in Bataan. The two brothers, right? They separated. One went to Naga to make his fortune there. He was the violinist who used to play for a zarzuela company in Manila. The other one went to Bataan and married into a family there. And the widow of this man who was shot gave his daughters to her brother-in-law to take care of while she returned to the stage. So she returned to Manila with her son, her only son, and returned to the stage. So these are my forebears, right? So, yeah, that's the story of my... Why did I tell you that story? Did you ask me about it?
Because I was asking about your home and your stories, and there are living in dangerous times and in dangerous places seems to run a lot in your family.
You mean Beirut? No. Living in Beirut was the choice of my husband. He joined, after martial law was declared, we both lost our jobs. So this is present day, 20th century. I was teaching in UST, and my husband was working for he was working for an American oil company. He left his job when the first quarter storm, the anti-Marcos movement, when he left his job with an American company and went to Ateneo to do his MA in political science because he had decided that he didn't want to work for a multinational company anymore. And then he accepted a job teaching in PCC, which was now the forerunner of PUP. So it was an activist university, college, Philippine College of Commerce, but it was an activist college. So he was there, and then he accepted a writing job with a graphic magazine. So that was his job, and I was teaching in UST, and we became part of the anti-Marcos movement. No? We were activists, in fact. So when martial law was declared, we both lost our jobs. He was, PCC, it used to be called Philippine College of Commerce, right? It was closed down, and they were all fired. His dean was Dante Simbulan, who was a leader of the Communist Party. You know, he was a leftist leader. And their president was also jailed. So these two men were jailed, President Prudente, Clemencio Prudente, and Dean Dante, oh my, I forget his, Simbulan. Dean Dante Simbulan was his dean. They were jailed. And everybody else was fired. So I was afraid that from day to day that my husband would be fired, right? Myself, I was fired from UST for being part of that activist movement. So we were jobless. When martial law was declared, we were fired from our jobs. Eventually, we learned that they weren't very good about records keeping, the military, because my husband was then hired by the Development Academy of the Philippines, which was set up by Boy Morales, who later left and joined the NPA, actually. But anyway, that's another story. And I was hired by UP. So apparently, UP had a lot of vacancies because a lot of its faculty went underground or were jailed. So they had these vacancies, right? And the English department, which was headed by Damiana Eugenio, looking through her files to try and fill these posts that were vacated by the likes of Luis Teodoro and Petronilo Daroy and Temi Rivera, well, they found my application. She found my application. So she called for me. Hindi ko na lang kinuwento that I was fired by UST. No? So I got hired by UP, which was really, at that time, the better choice because we enjoyed a little freedom in UP still, whereas UST talaga, I was not an important activist, you know, and they fired me for just joining rallies. I wasn't involved in any deep way, but of course I was part of that movement, anti-Marcos movement, definitely, no. And my husband was a writer he joined the Philippine Graphic, which was the activist newspaper, and he was teaching in PCC, which was the activist university. So when martial law was declared, we both lost our jobs, and then he was able to get a job with the Development Academy of the Philippines. Because I think Marcos's policy in the beginning was to try and co-opt even yung hindi naman talaga komunista, na may proof na komunista, you try to absorb them. So Tony got a job in DAP, which was a government entity, Development Academy of the Philippines, and then I was hired by UP. So apparently we were not on their top priority list or anything like that, right? But shortly after that, he realized that the Marcos government was not serious about reforms, and he chose to leave it when he got this offer from UNICEF. And that's how we ended up living abroad. Yeah. And so we were not here for the worst of the Marcos regime. We were spared that. But we also were not here for people power, which was something we really, really minded missing. It was like my husband's reaction was, okay, this is our punishment for having left the country, for having abandoned the country. Yun. And I think it is eventually what led him to give up his job with UNICEF and come home. When Cory Aquino had won and it looked like the Philippines was on its way to being a true democracy again, he decided to quit his job with UNICEF after working there for 15 years and come home, which broke our daughters' hearts, by the way, because they liked it in New York City. That's where we were living when he came home. But for him and me, it was never... Well, I'll have to say that I also was a bit frightened when he decided all of a sudden to come home, to just quit his job, which was a very good job, I'll have to say, and come home. But I came to see that it was the right decision, that our children needed a country, because they were so dismayed at the thought of coming home. So we thought, oh my goodness, we succeeded in doing what we never wanted to do, which is produce children who have no country. So I agreed to come home. Our children were angry with us in the beginning. They thought they were in the center of the world, New York City. Yeah, so it was difficult for them. And when we came home, it was to all these coups. You remember what it was like? No, you're too young.
4 years.
Yeah, during the Cory years, there were so many coups. So it seemed that a very unstable situation. So at first I thought, naku, it was a mistake to come home. But I do believe it was the right decision. We did provide our children with a country. Later, they made a decision to leave as adults. That was their decision. So that's all right. We did give them a country, which I think everyone needs.
A sense of home.
Yes, a sense of home. They will always have this to come home to, should they want to, as we did. But that was that was my husband's decision, really. And it is something I am proud of, actually.
Were you, speaking of being children, when you were a child, have you always wanted to be a writer? Or did you want to be something? Yes?
I never wanted to be anything else. I grew up surrounded by books. My mother was a writer. My mother was one of the first Filipino women journalists. So she wasn't just a writer, she was a journalist. She lost, it was her grandfather who was executed as a member of the Katipunan. Her father was shot to death. He was a governor of Bataan. And you remember in my story to you, the brother who was executed, his widow gave her daughters to her brother-in-law and brought the son to Manila, and she returned to the theater. Those daughters, therefore, grew up with their uncle. My Lola fell in love with her first cousin, who was the son of that uncle, right, and married him. They got papal dispensation to do this. The man she married became the governor of Bataan. That's the province where my grandfather, the brother of the one who was executed, went to Bataan, right? The two brothers of the two sons of the priest separated, right? One went to Bataan and married there. The other one took his wife, who was an actress in the Philippine stage, to Naga. Yeah. That was the man who was executed. So his widow came back to Manila and gave her daughters to her brother-in-law. One of the daughters fell in love with her cousin, who became the governor of Bataan. He was shot to death during a parade. So, ganun ang buhay ng pamilya namin. So, kind of colorful. Why did I tell you that story?
Because we talked about your mom who was a journalist.
Yeah. Well, so my mother and my sister grew up with their uncle. And then my mother, she was studying in public schools. The public schools were very good during the American period. And then she went to school, she was a freshman in UP. When she got offered a job to be a columnist in the newspapers, she was a socialite. She actually complicated yung buhay ng mga pamilya ng mother ko. She had an uncle, remember, among the children of the widow of the one who was executed in Bagumbayan. The widow took her children to Manila, right? The girls she gave to her brother-in-law, in effect. The son she kept with her. That son realized that he had no future in Manila because the money of his father was all confiscated, and property, the guy who was executed, he was left with nothing, right? So the actress, my great-grandmother, was supporting herself and her son. He realized there was no future for him here. So when his two older sisters were married, that's my Lola, who married her first cousin, right? And her older sister, who married, I think, a newspaperman. My uncle, my Lolo, the son who went with his mother to Manila, the actress, he asked his older sisters if they could finance him so he could go to the States to study dentistry.
Okay.
I don't know why he wanted to Oh, kasi very undeveloped daw yung dentistry dito. So, he went to the States. He worked as a houseboy. They could only afford to give him money for his pamasahe, no? And then when he got to the States, he found a job as a houseboy with an American couple who were childless, and they liked him so much. They decided to pay for his education. So he became a dentist. The first dentist, yung tawag doon orthodonty, yung braces ba? So when he came to Manila, he became the first orthodontist here. So he became rich. And then he took his sister, my Lola, who was widowed because her husband was the governor who was shot in Bataan. All of this is in my novel, actually. And then, my mother became a socialite. And she was offered a job to be the society editor of a newspaper in Manila. I forget if it's the Manila Times or Manila Tribune. So she gave up her studies to become a journalist. But she was also a short story writer. So that's where the writing gene comes from. Yun.
So they readily accepted you with
that
your
I wanted
choice,
to be a writer? My mother?
Your mom.
Oh, yeah. No, I think she surrounded me with books from childhood because she wanted me to be a writer, and I didn't have any other talent. I couldn't sing, I could dance, but it was out of the question naman to be a dancer, diba?
Oh.
Yeah, ballet. No, I like dancing. I just like dancing. When there would be music, I would dance. So my mother decided, okay, have her study ballet. No? So I studied ballet for a while, and piano, and the usual things. But I really wanted to be a writer, and I didn't have any other talents. I couldn't cook, I couldn't count.
Dentistry, no?
No, dentistry, no. I didn't want to be a doctor. I was scared of blood. I didn't want to be a lawyer, nothing. Just wanted to write the books that I was reading. I started reading from yung mga fairy tale pa. Oh, and I must tell you this. My tita, the one whose fiancé was killed by the Japanese, she took care of me. After the war, we had no maids, of course. No? So my tita was my yaya. And she would tell me stories. You know, I was a very sickly child. Kasi nga, I almost died during the war, diba? So to make me eat, she would be feeding me. No? She would tell me stories. I remember I heard Gone with the Wind from her. Of course, for a child, no? Parang transformed. So she would say, and so Rhett Butler entered the house, and there was Scarlett O'Hara, and then, open your mouth. And then she would feed me. And then I'm like, what happened to Scarlett O'Hara, right? And then, kutuloy yung kwento. Tapos, you know, and then the city was on fire, and open your mouth. So she told me stories. She was my yaya, my tita Pasita. I so loved her. And when I was older, she told me the story of the hero, the boyfriend who was a guerrilla fighter and was killed along with all his family and his neighbors and everyone. So I think I had no other option but to become a writer. And that story is actually in Recuerdo. All these stories I'm telling you now, they are in that novel. That novel is actually the story of my family. And of course, other stories that I heard, no? But that tita who took care of me is the one who turned me into a storyteller. Because she would tell me stories the whole time to make me eat, to make me sleep, so that I would take a siesta kasi nga I was a sickly child. Or you go to sleep. First, I'll tell you a story. Then, before the climax, she would stop. And then, okay, now it's time to sleep. And then, when you wake up, we will continue the story. Yun. So, I think that's how I became a storyteller. Yeah.
Would you know which one of your books sold the most? Which stories sold the most? Sold, yeah.
Pilipinas, pinag-uusapan ba yung soul?
Kailangan.
No, but
so they'll know that writers.
No, I do know, actually. After I finished writing my first novel, which is the story of my family, right, called Recuerdo, no? That novel ends with the generation of my children already. So it was a very difficult novel to write, and after I finished it, I was so tired. And I thought, I will write something that is easy. So I will write something that's very simple. Like I will tell stories that are stories I heard as a child, or I will write about my childhood. So I wrote Catch a Falling Star, which is about my childhood, a series of stories, no? About a girl I called Patriciang Payatot, no? Because I was that girl, the skinny girl, skinny and sickly and lonely and nervous and timid and frightened, but with a very lively imagination. That's Catch a Falling Star. To my great surprise, when I finished it and I submitted it to, there's a funny story related to it, which I'll tell you. When I saw that it was developing into a series of stories about the girl I called Patriciang Payatot, it was really based on me, no? By the time I had written several stories na, she was already in high school. And then she was fine. The last story, not the last story I wrote, but the last story in terms of how old the child was, she was already in college. And then I made her fall in love with a character that I based on, would you believe, this is kind of funny, maybe I don't want this in, maybe you can censor it later. I just tell it to you. I based the character on Richard Gomez. I know, you see. Kasi Richard Gomez was a student in UP. Do you know that he was studying in UP?
Yes.
Yeah. He was a student in Mass Comm in UP. And you know, he was a sensation, right? So in my story about Patriciang Payatot, she was already in college and was no longer so skinny and so ugly and frail. She became the classmate of Richard Gomez, di ba? In my story, a character based on Richard Gomez. That I caused to fall in love with her. I actually wrote that story. But she didn't want to be in love with an actor. She actually looked down on him because she was Burgese, di ba? And all her classmates were like, you know, they kind of looked down on him. That's a story I wrote, no? Of course, it was not true. I'm much older than Richard Gomez. So I just set the story at the time when I was in college, di ba? Anyway, so in my story, that story ends unhappily because she couldn't really, she was too Burgese and too narrow-minded to face what she knew would be the disapproval of her family and all her friends, who would not approve of a movie actor, even if he looked like Richard Gomez. Actually, I have to admit, wish fulfillment fantasy lang naman yun. Why would Richard Gomez fall in love with Patriciang Payatot, diba? In fact, you know, I was teaching when Richard Gomez enrolled in UP. And I remember, I was a teacher, no? So I left my classroom, and then I saw this gorgeous, gorgeous man standing outside my classroom, leaning against yung balcon doon sa AS na nakaganyan. And then I'm like, I stared at him really with my mouth open, right? And then my student said to me, "Opo, siya yan." So I'm like, what can this Richard Gomez possibly be doing here? Then I found out nga that he was enrolled, that he was trying to get a degree in mass communications, diba? So the idea came to me na, what if, when Patriciang Payatot was in college, in UST, she should meet an actor who looked like that, right? And fall in love with him. Ang hindi ko nang natanong, why naman would he fall in love with me, right? With Patriciang Payatot, Richard Gomez? But anyway, I did write the story. And in the story, it doesn't end happily because she's too much of a snob to really want to be involved with an actor, a movie actor. Her entire family would never accept him. Her own classmates are shocked. Wish fulfillment talaga. Anyway, in my story, it ends unhappily. She breaks it off and realizes that she has actually betrayed herself because she does love him. And that story was published, by the way. Okay, when I put together Catch a Falling Star, I reread all the stories, no, and rewrote them. When I came to that story, I couldn't include it because it was not real. It was not authentic. It was wish fulfillment for me, right? But Richard Gomez would not have fallen in love with that kind of girl. First of all, she would not have been attractive enough for him. This would not have happened. So, when I wrote it, hindi nga lang na in love sa kanya, siya pa yung nakipag-break, di ba? Wish fulfillment fantasy talaga. So I'm like, yeah, this is not this is not a true, I mean, it doesn't ring right. It has a false note. So I never included that story in the collection. It was published, and I'm ashamed of it. My daughter found it one day and says, "Ma, did you write a story about an actor falling in love with Patriciang Payatot?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I did." But in defense of myself, I did not include it in the book. So it's not there. And therefore, the book is better. I think if I had included it, nako, people would have said, illusion, illusion naman. So, but you know, the reason actually why that story, the real live Richard Gomez, I felt bad because when he was enrolled in UP, actually, I was already a teacher. I heard that he was not treated well by, for example, the fraternity that he tried to join. He apparently walked up to a fraternity that was hanging out in their tambayan and asked if he could join, and they said, "No, you don't apply to join a fraternity. You are invited." Biro mo, they snubbed him. That's the fraternity, by the way, that my own husband belongs to. So, yabang nila, di ba? Sabi ko, ba't hindi ninyo, si Tony, my husband, when he heard about that, naggalit siya doon sa mga junior brads ang tawag sa kanila. Sira ba ulo ninyo? You rejected Richard Gomez. Imagine what he could do for the frat. He could, you know, he's got money, he will support your projects. Ang yabang naman ninyo, ganun. Anyway, but he was not treated so well in UP, I think. I remember he won an award kasi there were these awards given by UP for outstanding artists every year. Sino pa naman ang bibigyan ng award for acting kundi siya, di ba? He had a good movie at the time that was a candidate for the FAMAS or something. So, I have to tell you this, we can end on this note. Because he was, so it was the awards ceremony, no, for those who had won that year, one for different art forms. I was there, I had won that award myself as a writer, no, but at the time I was there to watch the ceremony. And then he was the winner for acting, but people did not applaud. They called his name, and then he came up. He was in a barong, you know, and he came up this stage on this side, and he had to walk this way to where the chancellor was standing, which was here. But as he was walking, when he got to the center, he looked up at the audience, and he just smiled. You know, there was this spontaneous applause. Kasi when he climbed the stage pa lang, you could hear this, kasi ang gwapo-gwapo ni Richard Gomez. He was young, he was still young, and really at the height, I think of it, lahat talaga kami, and then natawa siya. He was in the center at the time, the audible sigh talaga, no? So, he looked up and he smiled and bowed, and then he walked towards the chancellor. And then you got this thunderous applause, no? Ang yabang-yabang talaga ng UP, looking down on Richard Gomez, but falling in love with him when he climbed the stage. So, actually, that's why I decided to write that story, partly, no? Because my wish fulfillment din siguro, of every woman wants Richard Gomez to fall in love with her, but also because I thought he was not treated well. Yung parang he was snubbed, and like the frat turned him down. Parang, sino ka ba? We have to invite you. Just because you're an actor, tatanggapin ka ba namin? Parang ganun yung pagka-snub talaga ang UP kasi eh. On the one hand, populist daw. On the other hand, you look down on an actor who has talent naman, ano, and was getting an award for his acting, not for anything else. So, yun, that's what made me write the story partly. Part of it was also wish fulfillment. Who is the woman who does not want to have Richard Gomez fall in love with her, right? So, Patriciang Payatot was no exception. Pero yun na yun.
So, final question. When I was in your MA class, if you remember, when I was in your MA Creative Nonfiction class, you terrified me. When you gave me that one requirement, you said, I only have one requirement for all of you, and that is to impress me. So,
to impress me, I think.
Yes. And then, so, what would it take to impress you? So it's something like, it's a question of what would you want to see in writers, Philippine writers now?
Now.
Now, yes.
Yeah, I must first apologize to you, Dawn. I must have been a terrible snob. I mean, kaartehan lang ata yung mga ganyan na mga, I want you to impress me, mga ganon, ano. I apologize for having been at one time in my life like that. Now, I think that what I would ask of my students is simply honesty and hard work. I have learned humility with the years, if nothing else. I have learned, for example, that one of my students whom I thought did not really have any talent and kept getting, di ba may nag-enroll naman sa creative writing na wala namang talent talaga. Ewan ko nga ba kung bakit sila nag-enroll. But I came to realize that you cannot write off people because you think they don't have talent, because you can learn how to, it's a skill that you can pick up. No? More important is honesty, I think. And I don't know what other qualities, courage maybe. I'm going to tell you about a writer, and because if she did not become a successful writer, I would not tell you the story, but she was a student that I was convinced had no talent whatsoever. So when yung mga ganyan, impress me, kasi nga, some of my students, I thought, did not have talent. So they were just wasting their time enrolling in creative writing na hindi naman marunong talagang sumulat, hindi naman natututo, 3 semesters na. But this woman, because she was not a young girl, no? She was a professional who stopped working for a while to get a degree in creative writing, an MA in creative writing, because she wanted to write. And then she came to me after the 3rd semester, tapos sabi niya sa akin, Ma'am, please be honest with me. If I have no talent, please tell me, para I will not waste my time anymore. Kasi her grades were always below par, no? And I considered being honest, and then I thought, no, you have no right to say to anyone that she has no talent. So I said to her, no, I would not say to you that you have no talent. I would just say to you that maybe you have to work a little harder, and it will come to you. I didn't start a writer. I just wanted to be a writer. I used to write 1 story a year lang. So I said that to her. You know, the next year, she won a palanca.
Wow.
I happened to be at the awards night because I was a judge for another category, and I had read that story, and siya pala yun, author. Her style had changed, and she merited the palanca na. Imagine, if I had discouraged her, she would have stopped writing, right? But she went on from there to write her first collection, and now she's written a 2nd collection. Her name is Dada Fres Phoenix. Both her books were published by UP. So she had the talent. I would have done her a grave injustice had I told her what I thought was the truth at the time, that you don't have talent. So yeah, well, in answer to your question, I think it's more important that you be honest and that you work hard. And if you really want to become a writer, you will, I think, make it, as Dada did. So, yun. That's one lesson I learned, and I learned it late. Mayabang din ako eh. Di ba? May tendency yung mga writer or artist na tingin nila may talent sila. May tendency maging mayabang. Pero with age, I have learned humility. And one of the people who taught it to me is Dada. And I'm so grateful that I did not discourage her when she actually asked me point blank, that I chose to give her the benefit of the doubt and say, no, try some more. And she did, and it turned out, she might even be more talented than me. Who knows, right? Because now she's already written 2 books, and they're very good. So I'm so pleased that I met Dada again in Philippine Pen, and that she's doing well.
Yeah. What a beautiful note to end with. It was so inspiring. Thank you, Ma'am Jing.
The book that I chose to read from is called Tales for a Rainy Night. It's, I think it's my favorite of all the books I've written, and I couldn't tell you why. When I started writing it, I was experimenting with a new form, and I didn't even know at the time that it was going to turn out to be a new form. I used to write realist fiction, and of course a lot of non-fiction. But this one, they're actually fairy tales for adults, modern fairy tales. And I had no idea when I started writing them whether they were any good.
since I'd never done it before. But I seem to have tapped into a different source of energy, so that the writing came very easily. The stories get written one after the other, which was very rare for me, because before this, my two other fiction books, I would take I would take 1 year to write each story. So this one was incredible for me, because the stories just get written one after the other. And the story I'm going to read is the first of them. I was in Baguio with my family. I had just come from teaching for the first time in the UP National Writers Workshop, which was the last workshop to be held in the campus of UP Diliman. And that particular batch was an extremely good bunch. They were extraordinary writers. Like, included were Sarge Lacuesta and Vincent Groyon, Oreo Solito, Paulo Manalo, Neil Garcia, Chris Martinez, Rebecca Año Nuevo, a whole bunch of young people who went on to become very, very well-known writers. So I'm thinking that part of the energy was that, the energy that, excuse me, the energy that came from these young people and what they were doing and saying and thinking. The other source of the energy, I have no idea what it was. Anyway, here's the, and when I was writing them, I wanted to listen to music, and it had to be opera music. It couldn't be any other kind of music. And I didn't want to be bothered, I didn't want to be disturbed. I felt offended when my children tried to talk to me, or my husband, or just wanted to write. So this story is called The Most Beautiful Woman
In the Island, and it's written like a traditional fairy tale. There's a prince, a young man. He's not an actual prince, but he's one of those young men who is born with all kinds of gifts. He can do everything and anything. The one thing he doesn't know how to do is how to swim. But he's attached to his boat. He has a boat that he likes to go sailing in, and that worried his parents, because since he couldn't swim, if he were to have an accident, he might die, right? But every time he could steal away from his duties, he would go out in that boat. And one time, as he was out on that boat, he found himself in a part of the sea that he had never been to before, and he got really excited because he knew he was on the verge of maybe finding what he had been looking for all this time, and which was the cause of his restlessness. So the boat, he landed on what looked like an island, but turned out to be, in fact, a mountain. So it was an island, but it was also a mountain. And it had a little town, and he went in there, and he felt like he was where he should be. But for the longest time, he did nothing there. He would just go walking. He had to buy some clothes, because when he had come, he didn't have anything. And during one of these walks, he found this old gate, and he thought, that's where I'm supposed to go. So he went in there, and it was like an overgrown garden, full of flowers and overgrown plants. And there he saw this woman who was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and she was much older than he was. So this is the story of what happened afterwards. No? And so the part I'm going to read is halfway through, when he realizes that she is the woman who completes him, but he has also heard that she's very ill and will probably die. He resolved that he must ask her. She must tell him, and then he would go away. But for the first time, Maria Monteverde would not listen, choosing to speak instead of songs and dragonflies, of the moon and fireflies, of horses racing through emerald meadows, of marble temples in India and tiger hunts in Kenya, and mermaids dancing the reggae under the sea, pouring out more tea in her small handleless cups, while outside her windows the April sky burst into flame. He resolved never to return to the old house and the hill, resolved never to see Maria Monteverde again. He stayed away for a day, for 2 days, and on the third night felt such desolation that he grabbed his jacket and flung himself out of the little brown inn and into the street. The town had been plunged into darkness, for the town's power supply had failed, and he made his way by his own blind instinct and the light of a pallid moon. Shrouded in mist and moonbeams, the old house looked ghostly, ephemeral, illusory. He had a fleeting feeling that he had been long abandoned, that everything which had happened to him had happened in a dream. But the front door opened at his knock. The maid said yes, Mrs. Monteverde was waiting for him, and disappeared into the shadows, leaving him to find his way by the flickering flames of tapering candles. She was sitting in her usual place by the fireplace, dressed in something long and white, which covered her arms to the wrists, but left her throat and part of her shoulders bare. She did not move at his entrance. He took a chair across the room from her and sat there, humble, defiant, utterly certain and completely confused, driven to silence by his desire and his despair. And once again he heard it, the music, faintly at first, and then more clearly and sweetly than ever before, as clearly and sweetly as if indeed she had spoken the rooms there, in the firelit room, "Sing for me now, beloved stranger." He was motionless, suspended in time, straining to capture the fugitive music. Sing for me now, beloved stranger, poet, pilgrim, troubled dreamer, rebel, minstrel, gentle healer. I will gather jasmines in my garden and hide them in my hair. And the clamor and the fury, tempest, gunfire, hellfire, would be fitful thunder in the distance, for tonight I will be 22. He leapt to his feet, crossed the room swiftly, stopped a few steps away from her. He had risen too, and now stood very straight and slim and still by the noble fireplace. When she held her hands out to him, he could not tell if it was to draw him closer or to keep him back. And as he stepped into the dream, he saw that she was as white as her dress, but her eyes shone like stars.